another AirInsight webcast. Today we've got the AirInsight team, Addison Shonland, and myself, Ernie Arvey, to talk about the Farnborough Air Show. The Farnborough Show happened last week, as most of you know, and we wanted to give you our reactions to the show and what we think that means for the industry. So, Addison, let's start and talk about the mood of the show. What did you think when you were walking around?
There was clearly it was a much quieter show than before. Certainly much quieter than Paris a year ago. Obviously, the absence of Boeing airplanes to see and to watch. But generally, we have fewer people in the industry. There used to be a Bombardier. There isn't a Bombardier anymore. De Havilland was there, but had no planes to look at and demonstrate. ATR had a plane, and that was flying around, but had no briefings. And then when we went to visit them, they said to us, "Well, we're busy with customer visits. We don't have time for a briefing," which is odd. Everybody has time at the show to talk to media because this is your moment to talk about what you're achieving. So I think that there definitely was a subdued mood.
I think one of the things that differed from going into it is we were looking at some of the earnings reports from the airlines, and the third quarter hasn't been shaping up as nicely for a good number of them, and particularly in Europe, as well as now some weakness showing in the U.S. market, and that showed the first signs of fear that we've seen in a long time since the pandemic. Things have been coming back, and finally reaching pre-pandemic levels. And we've seen airlines now getting worried about capacity expansion instead of fear of missing out, which we had been seeing of people ordering, even though they can't get new airplanes till 2030 or 2031. So it's a mixed reaction there among the airlines, but we're seeing the first signs of a change in attitude, and that may also have contributed to the subdued atmosphere that you mentioned.
It's interesting that it's certainly amongst the U.S. carriers, this fear thing. The industry has been tracking well over 80% load factor. You can't get a seat on a plane unless you book early. So I find that to be there's an oddity. There's something missing here. They talk about that there's an excess supply and get out of here. You can't get a seat. When you have a meltdown, as we saw recently with Delta, it takes not just one day, it takes more than a day or two. People were sitting in Atlanta airport for 3 days trying to get out because there's no capacity to handle these interruptions. So I find that there's something I'm not quite being able to, can't quite put my fingers on it. Do we have a capacity problem or do we not? Because everybody has high load factors and you can't move people when there's a shock to the system. What actually is the truth, the whole truth?
I think the truth is a revenue problem, and we've had some airlines do very well recently, Delta and United particularly, on premium fares and premium cabins, and increasing the percentage of premium seats on their airplanes, versus some of the LCCs who have been struggling with low cost. So I think what we're seeing is the people who are wealthy taking the premium leisure trips, but we're still missing that high yield business capacity which isn't quite back, even though they say business travel is back. Meetings like this over a call when we're in two different cities, we used to have to travel to do this in the old days, and that still makes a difference. I think the electronic substitution factor is here. And I think it's having an impact, and it's having its impact on overall yields. And of course, when there is a problem, as you mentioned, it is a disaster and can quickly turn to a meltdown.
The example that I'm thinking about as you described that, Ernie, is Southwest. They ordered all these MAX 7s. They can't get them. They got MAX 8s. Everybody thought, well, including us, this is not a good thing for them. They used to be 65% of their fleet was the 737-700 NG. Now it's over 50% is either 800 NG or the MAX 8. That's a change of gauge essentially for that airline. And they're out of gauge compared to what they used to be. But it worked out for them because the traffic came back so hard and so fast. We had a V recovery in air travel in this country, not a swoosh like we thought we were going to have. And guess what? Southwest had the seats to sell. So again, they doth protest too much.
Now the question is at what price, and I think that's what's happening there. But I think the demand for aircraft is still there,
Right.
and we've seen fuel savings of 15% with the latest models, and that still pays off as you retire your fleet and you keep it going. The problem with the slowdown in orders is once you say, okay, I'm going to renew this aircraft and do the maintenance required to keep it in service for a while, you're basically stuck for another 5 years
Right.
because you've spent a lot of money and you've got to keep that airplane going. So that can be a differentiating factor as well. So if we're keeping it longer, do we slow down the intake on some of the aircraft? And is that okay with the airlines now that Boeing and Airbus are a little bit slow when they're having second thoughts about things?
So, excuse me. The problem you have there is the one that nobody could have planned for, which we've done. We've done some stuff about the great retirement. There's the hollowing out of the skill set in the MRO space and in airline maintenance space. And you talk to the OEMs in the engine business or anybody in the supply chain, there's been a hollowing out of the skills. So even if you have young people coming into the industry, they don't have mentors to teach them as much as they used to have. And there's also a change in terms of things like AI and digitalization, which means that the young people know how to make that work, but they don't necessarily have the context of how to make it work in this silo of commercial aviation. So there's a huge change going on in terms of the skill set. There's a shortage of experienced hands, old hands at the business. But there's also this massive change in technology, which every company has to embrace, because how do you accelerate these young people down the curve to become productive? Bottom line is, as I spoke to an executive today, we're talking 5 years, and we're probably a year into that 5 of getting the right people to the right level of experience. As this person said to me, typically we had 5% of our skill set as new hires. Now it's 30%. That's very scary, because in this industry, there is zero tolerance for anything that will impact safety. So now there's no margin for error, but you've got all these unskilled people. It's learning, trying to do the best they can, as I'm sure everybody would say, but this slows everything down. And as you point out, if you're not getting your new delivery on time, great. So you send in your airplane for a D check or a C check, great. But by the way, as we've seen with both big OEMs, then that's 90+% of the deliveries, they are not even sure when they can make the delivery date when they say they can. So you've got lots of wobbliness in the business.
Yeah, the shifting skylines, I think, and yo-yoing of customers around in terms of order dates, and it seems just like when you have a delay at the airlines and they say we'll have an update in 15 minutes, we'll have an update in a half an hour, we'll have another update. We're getting the same thing for the airlines from Boeing, as well as the supply chain, in terms of how that ramp up is coming along. And unfortunately, it does take 2 to 3 years to get a new employee productive.
Right.
And if you've got 30% new employees coming on, you've got a real productivity gap in the near term that's going to be costly in the supply chain. And that's also something that's unsustainable. The other factor that I think is happening that we ought to mention is, we've seen the supply chain being asked to build at certain rates. For Boeing, it was 38 a month for the 737 since 2023 that they've asked their supply chain to produce. Yet they've been delivering only 22 on average. So you've got that gap of 16 ship sets of things that have been coming in for about a year now. How long can you do that before you say, hey, I got to stop the inventory flow, there's no more? And I think we're going to see a destocking level come out of Boeing now for the suppliers, and a cutback of those rates. And I think some of the suppliers have cut back already in terms of production, because they don't believe and don't have credibility with for the OEM forecasts anymore.
That's funny. It's a great item to bring up because Christian Scherer, on Sunday night before the show started, there was an Airbus event, and I was lucky to be there. And I heard him make this speech, and he said, "Well, we don't want people in the supply chain to second guess us in terms of our rate." Come on, are you kidding? If you're in the supply chain, that's everything. How do you know how to capitalize? The contracts are written so that all the risk is on the supplier to the OEM, whether to accelerate or whether to deaccelerate, and you have to take the risk on both ends. So of course they're going to second guess. They have to. How do they de-risk their business? So that again, we have this transparency question. What's really happening? Are we really getting the objective truth? There's a lot of uncertainty in the business.
There is, and I think historically partnerships, and we have the old partnering for success program and others seem to have been one-way streets in favor of the OEM.
Right.
And now with the supply chain broken, there's a little more. Is there a power shift coming, and will we see some slight realignments of the supplier OEM relationships coming out of this crisis? And that's something I think some of the suppliers are looking at as to what can we do to make our position better in the future and to avoid these kinds of mismatches.
Right.
So it should be interesting to watch how the supply chain OEM relationship evolves. But that's also going to depend on the leadership change at Boeing, and certainly Airbus providing more credible estimates, and it'll be interesting to watch. I'm not sure we have an answer as to how that's going to evolve, but
I think
it's going to be interesting.
I think only we could say that, for example, Boeing bringing Spirit back in-house is an example of trying to de-risk their business. Their bread and butter program is the 737. They need to protect that, and they need to stabilize that. And what we might see is some more vertical integration because people have to de-risk. Now, by the way, that's where Embraer is really strong. They have more of their parts and pieces generated internally. And as you and I've mentioned before, in both in stories and in webinars and things like that, they grow their own skill set. So there's a case of less risky, perhaps, at Embraer than it is for Boeing and Airbus. But of course, those parts that you need, the classic example on Sunday, there were several people in the media saying, "Well, don't you think that Comac is going to Comac could step into the duopoly?" And I had to try and say to people, please understand, Boeing and Airbus individually produce more airplanes in a month than Comac does in a year. There's no way Comac gets to that level anytime soon. Would they like to? Yes, but A, they're not at that rate, and B, a lot of their parts are dependent on Western suppliers. They depend on the same supply chain.
Exactly. Well, let's change the subject for a minute to environment, because I think that's something that's certainly bigger every year when we go to Europe than it is here in the U.S. And unfortunately, because I think it's still an important issue. But is electrification infeasible for airlines? Is hydrogen problematic? Where do we stand on the environment? And what did you think the mood was at the show in terms of, are we going to make that 2035 goal of 50%?
Okay, so I'm going to stick my neck out a little bit here because that's what I do. I think that the net zero promises that these executives made at IATA in Boston a couple of years ago was a bad thing. They made promises that their grandchildren are going to have to deliver. These executives will not be in the industry. They may not even be alive when net zero time rolls in. So I think that was a really awful burden to put on people that probably are if they're around at the moment, they're at school, little kids. I think that there's a sense of skepticism, growing skepticism about all this green stuff because there's not enough SAF. Yes, everybody wants SAF, but there's not enough SAF. And how do you make SAF more available? Give an example. There's a rule in the EU now that you have to, if your airplane leaves the European Union, they're making these rules now, a certain percentage of the fuel in that airplane has to be renewable fuel like SAF. So now the airports in Europe have to figure out, well, what's going to come in tomorrow? What's the fuel requirement of that airplane? And where am I going to get the percentage of SAF? Again, you've got these, broad policy decisions, but how do you, when the rubber hits the road or the fuel hits the tank, how do you make all this? How do you stay within the rules? So the green thing is popular. Hydrogen is popular, despite Universal going out of business. Hydrogen is very popular. SAF is very popular. Everybody would like to make this work, but so many people neglect. If you look at this industry, the airline industry has been saving around 1 to 2% fuel burn per year for decades. If 45% of your operating costs are fuel, your best and your brightest at every airline thinks about that all day. How can we save fuel? Do we need these big rules? Do we need this craziness? I don't know. I'm of the view that I think the policy, these policies are a little bit heavy and not maybe as practical as they could be, but there we are. So yes, in Europe it's a big thing because they've got overwhelming government. It's going to be a challenge for anybody to meet these requirements.
I think the other factor that nobody talks about is the fact that SAF is way more expensive than jet fuel.
Right.
And you've got to make a margin. So if you're passing that on to customers, you're going to see a reduction in demand and a reduction in growth. So we've got we either have a smaller industry running on SAF, or we need to find a way to make it affordable, and to leverage our technology to do that. But that's going to take a new airplane, and it's going to take probably something that may look like a flying wing instead of a tube, or maybe the struts on the transonic wing for Boeing.
Right.
But planes are going to look a bit different. Yet no one wants to pull the trigger and say, "Hey, here's the next airplane," because we don't know what's going to happen on the engine side to put on top of it. So,
right.
What'd you think of the engine guys at the show? And are we making a lot of money on current MRO? And
right.
But what's the next step there?
So I think that the engine guys are trying not to attract attention, because they're making bank right now with spare parts. And by the way, it's not just Pratt. CFM-GE is also making bank. The GE 9X is now ready to go on the 777X. That program is starting to move forward with certification, which is really important. But I think that the thing to look at is Rolls-Royce is interested now in getting into the single aisle market with some version of its geared engine. It's going to be fascinating to see what happens there when they run into Pratt's patents, because I'm sure a patent war is coming, and Rolls-Royce has lost a previous patent war with Pratt & Whitney. Then, of course, you've got the GE Rise, which is a fascinating technology, and hopefully we're going to have something on that soon. So we've reached kind of, probably Pratt says that they can continue to work on the design of the GTF to take it a lot further down the road, and they can get a lot more fuel efficiency out of it. GE and CFM are going in the open rotor solution. Rolls-Royce is also going down the road of the geared fan. Very interesting. They're all pushing their technologies and the materials to the very max. I heard a fantastic statistic, Ernie. The GE 90 and the GTF generate the same amount of heat in the core. This little one and that giant one make the same heat? Yes. The GTF is all about managing that heat. And we've seen that managing that heat sometimes hasn't been a great technical success. They have to tweak it to fix it. But the engine guys are obviously, as you point out, they're at the sharp end of the stick here, the sharp end of the spear, trying to make what's next possible.
Who's going to get first mover advantage as we look forward? We've got Boeing, who didn't pull the trigger on the middle of the market airplane, and is probably reluctant at this point until it gets its problem solved from launching something new. Airbus is looking extensively at hydrogen, but it also hasn't launched anything new in a while. So where does the next innovation come from, and who gets that first mover advantage in the industry?
That's the $64 billion question right there. I don't know. For example, we were in a briefing with Darren Hulst from Boeing, and the guy is very good at what he does. He went through his presentation. It was really good. And then the Q&A started. And one of the British media guys asked him, well, Airbus is pushing the single aisle long range airplane. Why don't you guys have it? What are you going to do to respond to that? And Darren went through the usual response, which is it's such a small segment of the market. We don't think that's really a business. And I think it is a small market. However, I'll get to my next point. So I said, Darren, can I ask you just as a follow-up to that question, is this not an opportunity for Boeing? Because you used to have the 787-3. Why don't you go back and think about that airplane and eclipse the 321 LR and XLR? Because those airplanes may have nice long range, they may have a useful payload in terms of passenger traffic. They cannot carry cargo. If you're flying a 321 LR or XLR from Europe to Africa, that market is very freight heavy. And these people travel with lots of bags. Those airplanes can carry that kind of a load. But a twin aisle can, because a twin aisle has just more of everything. So, when you look at what comes next, I don't know who's going to be the advantage, but clearly you're going to have a better GTF. Clearly you're going to have a Rolls-Royce, whatever, UltraFan, whatever they're going to finally give it a name, and you've got the Rise. So those three programs, I think, signal something. How they actually get implemented, I think that's going to be fascinating to see. So I don't know what more I can give you around that.
Yeah, I think that's fine. But how about AAM, the advanced mobility, and all of these wonderful new little city hoppers that we're seeing?
eVTOL.
Is the eVTOLs, is that market for real? And it seems to me that there are so many players that a shakeout's bound to come soon.
Well, do you remember what commercial aviation was like in the 1920s? Right? Everybody and his cousin was in a barn making an airplane, right? And then the consolidation happened, and look what we have left today. It's probably going to be like that again, but there's some very creative people making some very cool things. I still think that, as we've said several times in our articles, that you got to look at the people that have certified airplanes before, that know how to certify things for commercial use. Embraer is the golden child in that segment. They brought an Eve mock-up, which they showed. It's a pretty looking thing. It's novel, and they're not different than everybody else has got a variation on a theme. Boeing had their Whisk there. There were a number of them. As one person said to me, what these guys are doing is they're taking the congestion off the street and putting it in the air. So let's say your taxis and your Ubers are going to and Lyft vehicles are going to come off the street now, and they're going to be 500 feet, 700 feet, 800 feet, maybe 1,000 feet above the ground, flying these people around. No one talks about the economics of the stuff. It's going to be expensive. You can say, yeah, electric motors, they only have 2 moving parts. You can say battery power is so much cheaper. We've been told that so many times, and it'd be a great idea to fly across a big city like LA or Sao Paulo. We have a ways to go, I think, before we know that this stuff really meets reality. But it's a great technology exercise. You got to give them kudos for that.
That's true. And finally, I think as the last issue, let's move over to defense for a little bit, because defense is a big part of the show at Farnborough, and I get the sense that with Macron telling Dassault that act as if we're in a war economy and start making more Rafales, and NATO now spending most of the players now spending their 2% of GDP on defense, that the defense business in Europe is growing. Any sense from the show as to where that's going?
Well, the kind of people I was hanging out with, mostly the commercial people. Embraer was there with their case, the C390 Millennium, their military freighter, and they took the defense journalists on a ride in the airplane. They had a good show because they had the combined Dutch and Austrians. They bought 7 airplanes, and of course, no one ever only buys that few. They always buy more, and of course, there's a spare parts chain. So I think that there is a growing awareness within Europe that they've got to do something, because what's happening in Ukraine doesn't look like it's ending anytime soon. And if the Ukrainians are not successful, that's the problem on the Ukraine-Russian border is going to become a problem on the Polish border. And we see that, for example, Chinese soldiers are now on the Polish border doing exercises. What are Chinese soldiers doing on the border of Europe, in Belarus? So I think that the Europeans are very aware of the need to do something. And no, regardless of who's in the White House next year, their dependence on the United States has to be much more measured. It's just not in their interest to depend on the US. They have to have homegrown 155 millimeters ammunition. They have to have their own airplanes. They have to have their own artillery and armor. They need to have that stuff ASAP. The question, of course, is going to be, there's always trade-offs in public policy. Where's the money going to come from?
Exactly. And with that, I think we could talk all day, and often
Yes.
do. But I think that should probably give a pretty good wrap up for Farnborough. So thanks for listening, and tune in for our next podcast coming soon.